Moving on, shifting our focus to the United States House of Representatives, where the Democrats prevented a shutdown of the U.S. government by voting to fund the government into early December, suspend federal debt limit and provide disaster and refugee aid, setting up high-stakes showdown with Republicans who opposed the package despite the prospects of a looming fiscal crisis. The U.S. government funding is set to expire on the 30th of September, but the stopgap bill the House approved will extend the funding and keep the government open until 3rd of December. The interim bill, called the continuing resolution, includes a suspension of the U.S. debt limit. But what is this debt limit? It is basically the maximum amount that is allowed to borrow, that the United States is allowed to borrow and pay its debts. If the government breaches that limit, it would mean that it is unable to pay what it owes and default its own loans. Now, why is the debt limit raised or suspended? Governments raise the debt limit to allow the U.S. Treasury to pay for spending already approved. It does not greenlight new spending. The national debt limit has been raised or suspended over 100 times since 1917 when it was first introduced. The U.S. federal government relies on debt, regularly spending more than it raises in taxes. That is why the government's debt currently exceeds $28 trillion. Now, what the Democrats have done is suspend debt until after next year's midterm election in order to avoid defaulting on its loans. And defaulting would be an economic catastrophe at this point. Interest rate would spike, the stock market would collapse, value of the US dollar would plummet, spending on critical programs would freeze. There is even a greater risk. The dollar is the world's reserve currency, meaning other governments depend on it holding its worth. Defaulting would impact global financial markets and shake the world's confidence in the US currency as well. And this is why America has never defaulted, as Democrats stressed in this House.
This is not a Democratic debt. It's not a Republican debt. It is our debt. It is the debt of the United States of America. We don't welch on our debts. We pay our debts.
The legislation passed by the Democrats includes $28.6 billion in the new disaster aid for states hit by hurricane and wildfires. It also allocates $6.3 billion for resettling Afghans evacuated after the fall of Kabul to Taliban militants. And in theory, the measure would buy legislators time to negotiate full-year spending bills for the rest of the 2022 fiscal year. But with the Republicans dead set against it, is almost certain to fail in the evenly divided upper chamber, where it would need Republican support to back the necessary 60 out of 100 votes available. Now, U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen has warned that failing to raise the debt limit could send the U.S. economy spiraling just as it recovers from the pandemic.
This is nothing more than a trashy spending spree.
Is the financial crisis?
WION is now available in your country. Download the app now. Get all the news on the move.